Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. This presentation is being recorded and will run approximately 60 minutes, including question and answer time at the end, and will also be available in the Events Industry Council's Knowledge Hub. All attendees today will receive their CEs approximately 1 week after the webinar. Before I turn things over to our CEO, Amy Calvert, I would like to address a few logistical items. Attendees can listen to the webinar through their computers or by dialing in using the number and passcode provided by the Zoom software. If you have questions, you do not need to wait until the end of the presentation to submit them. We encourage you to submit your questions using the question box seen on your screen. We will address as many questions as we can at the end of the presentation. And now I'll hand it over to our CEO of Events Industry Council, Amy Calvert. Amy?
Thank you, Derek. Hello, everyone. I just wanted to send my greetings and my gratitude out to all of you. We had over 3,700 people register for today's webinar, and one interesting note is that we have people from over 44 countries joining us today. So I just wanted to say thank you to all of you for making time for this moment of learning and for community. I think it's so important for us to be together in this way at this time. We recognize this is really a time of unprecedented uncertainty and loss for so many, and our hearts and minds go out to those folks that are on the front line of our industry right now with the challenges that they face. I think it would be really appropriate to start today's program just with a moment of recognition, given what we see every day in the news for those frontline workers out there, whether they're in the healthcare or first responders for safety and security, who are really putting their own wellness on the line to serve others. And I want to just take a moment collectively with all of you to recognize their fantastic work for that, which we'll always be grateful. I want to also take a quick minute to thank our panelists. I think, on behalf of the Events Industry Council and our 33 member organizations and the over 100,000 professionals we represent across the globe, it's really been tremendous for us to be able to come together in this way and offer these resources for all of you. And it really wouldn't be possible, though, without the subject matter expertise and the dedicated volunteers that have given of their time and of their thought leadership so graciously to offer programs of this kind. So I would like to extend my thanks to all of you today. And then thanks to the team at the Events Industry Council for all the great work that they've done in order to put this together. I think it's really important, this is a virtual environment and the topic today is sort of self-evident, but we'd really like you all to be participatory and find ways to offer your knowledge and your questions through the chat function and through the Q&A, and really offer during and after your thoughts and support on social media. That would be fantastic. I'd like to at this time turn it over to Angie Ahrens. Angie is our moderator today. She's just an incredible champion for EIC, has led volunteer communities for us over the years. Angie's the VP of Operations for Leadercast and a subject matter expert in all things sustainability. And we really appreciate her expertise and her passion for our industry. And I'm going to turn it over to you and say thank you again to all our panelists.
Great. Thanks, Amy. We appreciate you being here and supporting the industry so much. As you mentioned, we have a really, really great panel today. We have 4 of us that are kind of going to walk through what it looks like to transition your live event to an engaging virtual experience. I know as event experience individuals, we are always trying to figure out the best way to do this. And today we're going to discuss the ways to do that. And we want you to participate with us. So first, let me introduce our panel to you. As Amy said, my name is Angie Ahrens. I'm the Vice President of Operations for Leadercast. I'm a media professional at heart and have been in the industry for about 15 years. Excited to work today with our panelists. We have Miguel Neves, who many of you may know as a social media strategist, the member of the MPI International Board of Directors as well, experienced event professional about social media advocacy, and regularly speaks across the country, internationally as well, to help organizations develop social media and digital communication strategies. We also have Paul Salinger with us. Paul is the VP of Marketing at Oracle. Paul is the Vice President of Marketing and part of the Corporate Marketing Management team. He's responsible for strategic communication and creative concepting across marketing. He works closely with the event marketing team and does design, content, and engagement strategies for Oracle. We're honored to have him join us, as well as Shauna Sylvester. Shauna joins us from she's the Executive Director of Simon Fraser University's Morris J. Wosk Center for Dialogue and co-founder and senior advisor of SFU Public Square. Definitely a mouthful, definitely a lot of great experience joining us as a skilled facilitator, social entrepreneur, and commenter on international issues. She's had many dialogues to really work across the facility of Canada, and we're really honored to have her with us today. So we have a lot of opportunities for you to engage with the four of us today. If we could go to the next slide, we'll kind of showcase a little bit. One way is to do this virtually with us. Here are all of our handles. This is one way to engage with us, especially if you have to drop off and you want to follow the conversation. We're all here to help you guide your way through this together. We also have our Q&A panel. We want you to ask your questions there, which I already see we have people asking them. Excited for your energy. And then we also want you to participate in our polls. So we have a couple different avenues. Note that we will give you some information at the end about getting your continuing education credits and working with the EIC for future webinars. This is being recorded and we're excited to give that information to you at a later date today. So first, we're going to start with Shauna. She has some really great content for us, and we're going to get started. So Shauna, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and good morning, everyone. I want to begin by acknowledging that I'm on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. And I'm doing that because I'm based in Vancouver, and it's our protocol when we have an in-person meeting to acknowledge Indigenous people. Now, I've done that as well because as we move to online platforms, I want us to remember that our platforms aren't neutral. All the same inequity, social, economic issues are still with us, and we need to ensure that our technologies are inclusive. So I'm really excited to be among you, and in part because you are the people that bring others together. You know what makes great meetings work. And like great hosts, you know how to welcome people, set the table, ensure everything runs without a hitch, and that people go home feeling a little bit better because of something that you've created. So in my next slide, my first message to you is that you have this. You have the skills, the capacities to make the transition to great online meetings. And you're better equipped than most. Now, while the technology and the platforms you choose matters, it's actually the skills that you bring in design, in hosting, in setting the tone and following through that will make the difference between a good online experience and a bad online one. So here are my 5 top essentials for what makes a great online meeting. And the first, and that's the next slide, is that the why matters. When you're designing an online meeting, you need to be crystal clear about why you're bringing people together. Is this information sharing? Is this to address a conflict, make a decision, educate? You need to do the same scoping you've always done. You need to identify what success means, what failure means, and you need to design to the objective. Now, the same rule applies to online meetings, maybe even more. It's going to be at least 75% to preparation for a great meeting. The next slide is my second, which is that participants are key. Now, in my job, I work in dialogue, and a big job that we have to do is level the playing field so that all participants walk through the room and feel like they are gold. So they need to be adequately prepared. They also need to have opportunities to be seen and heard and valued in an online setting. This is going to take more time. It's just, we almost give it twice as much time. So whether you have video cameras on, mics on or off, you're doing introductions in breakout rooms, or you're getting people to put up a message that you've asked them to prepare in advance and they all put it up at the same time so that you take a screenshot. Whatever it is, you need to acknowledge your participants at the beginning, at the end of a meeting. The third, and this is absolutely critical, facilitation is key. Having one person play the role of facilitators, guiding the process, acknowledging the speaker order for feedback or questions, and keeping the flow. Often when we're organizing online meetings, we have to profile people, sponsors, and so we put them in the role of moderator. Now, if they're not skilled, it's not fair to them. Give them other roles and keep the facilitation to someone who knows what they're doing. It's also critical that if you're going to have somebody focused on chats or other forms of technology, that you create co-hosts. So whatever you do, it's important that your facilitator is part of the design of the process so that they know when to pivot or change the agenda when they read the room or the virtual room and figure that they need to change things up. So the next slide talks about protocol and terms of engagement. Each online platform has different functionalities and capacities for engagement. And it's important well before a meeting begins that the organizers know how to work with the technology and have a clear sense of how they want the participants to interact with it. The next most important things is that participants know what is expected of them when they walk through the door. If your advanced planning doesn't enable that, as a facilitator, you need to go through some of those terms of engagement. No screenshots, for example, no recordings without permission, mics on or off, videos on or off, whatever works for you. Now, what's really important is the terms of engagement should reflect the spirit of the meeting. So you want to develop that with the organizers. Finally, different engagement styles for different learning styles. We all learn in different ways. Some of us are verbal, some like to learn by doing, some like time to analyze and think before they speak. We have introverted and extroverted personalities, and to add complexity, some people feel a great deal of anxiety going online. And they may have different ways of knowing and different contexts for an online engagement. So when you're designing your online meetings, you need to create the different ways to enable people to interact, whether that's giving them time to write things down before they respond, doing far more in smaller breakout rooms, using your chat function. What's most irritating is allowing those who feel most comfortable to dominate the conversation. So those are my top 5 essentials. And you know we could do a deep dive into any one of those, but I want you to remember that nobody's an expert here. We have Miguel and Paul, and they're great ideas, and they will bring deep expertise. But I also want you to know you should create the space to innovate and experiment. And some of those things are going to work, some are going to fail. And when you do collect your learnings, share them with all of us. We are all on a steep learning curve here. I want to end with a very quick story. The other day, a good friend of mine, mother died. She was 95 years old, and she was really well loved. And in her honor, a friend hosted a virtual memorial. We all had our gin and tonics, and that was Jean's favorite drink. And we came to that session. Now, there were times when we put our mics on so we could celebrate, and we took them off in those solemn moments. We watched and shared screens to see video and footage of Jean. And we also told stories and laughed and made toasts. Now, if anyone had told me that I would be attending a memorial 2 months ago for Jean online, I would have thought they were crazy. But you know, in the end, it was as beautiful and as tender as being in the same room. So I just want to say to you, and this is my last slide, you can do this. It's going to be different, but you know what it takes to have a great meeting. You've got this. Thank you.
Thank you, Shauna. I appreciate it. I wanted to revisit that poll we'd asked at the beginning. We were asking how you're feeling. And as Shauna just said, you're not in this alone. We saw answers from 1 to 7. Some of you are feeling really anxious. Some of you are feeling really good about this. So overall, you're feeling something, which is why you're here today, to get more content from us. And we just want to say thank you for being here. We do have another poll we want to bring up for you in this moment. If we could do the next slide really quick, we'll get this poll up for you. So what is your impression of the virtual meetings in general? We want you to kind of give us an idea of what you're thinking. Do you want to avoid it at all costs? Are you not a big fan? Are you, okay, I guess we can do this. Some are great or some are good. How do you feel about this? We are seeing a couple different answers, and you can say 1 to 3, but the majority of you are saying some are good, they're great, they're okay, I guess. All over the place in answers. So again, you all have varying answers, and that's why you're here today, to get the content. And here's a quick little poll this way too, if this is easier for you to answer on our end. While we collect that, I did want to look at our first question. Thank you for using the Q&A for the questions and the chat feature for the chat specifically. So if you do have a question you want to get answered, please toss it in that Q&A, because that's how we'll get you either a live answer or one that we can type to you individually. So the main question we have right now is a rough estimate of finances. What is a rough estimate of range going to a virtual platform? As you know, the range of costs for virtual platforms is all over the place, and I'm sure we'll get a little bit more into this in our upcoming presentation. But want to take a look at the quick poll results. Some are good. That's where we're at majority-wise, 62%. Thank you to everyone who took this result with us, this poll with us, to get us that answer. As we discuss more of the questions on here, do you have recommendations for platforms? That's a really big question we're seeing. And our next presenter, Miguel, will definitely give us some of that feedback. So I want to turn it over to our next panelist in this moment, and we will move forward. So the floor is yours, Miguel.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Hope you can hear me and see me okay. I want to jump right into it because I really want to save as much time as we can for the questions, which I think are coming in really strong. So I have kind of 10 tips, and this is really for the process of getting to a great virtual event. So my first tip is for you not to try and replicate face-to-face events. Now, I know this might sound a little counterintuitive, but just taking what is a 3-day conference that is 8 hours a day and putting that online, just through streaming, anything like that, that may not be the best thing that you can do for your audience, for your sponsors, for your association, for anybody involved. So just because it exists as an in-person event in a certain way and just trying to transfer it easily online, that may not be the right answer. I really prefer to talk about creating online experiences. Create an experience that uses the content, the knowledge, the message, the communication that you want to do, and do that online instead. And that may require a little bit of a shift in thinking. So my next point, next slide, would be to start with the why. And this is really about starting with objectives first, rather than copy and pasting past events. We've heard this a lot in real in-person events for many years, but I feel that many events still continue to follow very old formats for no real reason other than it's what we did last year, it's what people are expecting. So starting with virtual events really gives us an opportunity to ask those important questions again. What are the objectives? What are the objectives of the sponsors? What about the event owner? What about the participant? Of course, extremely important, getting the objectives right for the participant. So being able to ask those fresh and really try to design an experience based on that is super important. So I think the second point, starting with why, very important. My third point would be to partner with professionals. And echoing a little bit of what Shauna was saying and Angie, we are event professionals. We are professionals at gathering people to come together around content, around discussion. So I'm not saying that absolutely everybody can suddenly pivot to virtual events. Unfortunately, that's not the case. But when it comes to a lot of the things that we have to do, a lot of the jobs that we have, a lot of the tasks that we have around virtual events, a lot of them are transferable and a lot of them are the same. I went through an exercise recently. I went through all the 28 skills of the current CMP exam, and all but, I believe, 3 of them are perfectly transferable into virtual events. Things like speaker management, things like marketing, things like content, gathering abstracts, all these kind of things can still apply virtually. So it's really important to make sure that you partner with professionals, potentially that have good virtual experience, get the right people to do the right job, the people that understand the audience, the people that understand the technology. People like moderators are very, very important for online environments, and speakers that can do a good job in speaking online are very, very important. My next point is about designing the experience. And this is where virtual events start to merge a little bit to web design and online experience design. Because when you design an in-person experience, if you get your email slightly wrong, your marketing's not quite right, anything like that, people still have a pretty good understanding of what happens when they get to an event. There's a hotel or a convention center. You go, you sit, there's a keynote. There's a certain kind of structure that people are used to. But when it comes to online or virtual experiences, that can be completely new to a lot of people. So getting that design of the experience right from the first moment of communication, that first marketing email or advert or whatever it is, all the way to the survey after the event and all the interactions that happen online, you have to make sure you design that whole experience and be very clear, where is the one link that you want people to go? What is it that you want them to do? That has to be all designed for the participants from start to finish. Very, very important. Number 5, my 5th tip would be to map out all the video and audio interactions. Now, this may seem like a job for your AV team or for your live streaming partner, and it is, but they won't be able to do this unless you can decide really how everybody wants to see each other. If you're having just a Zoom meeting or a Skype style meeting with a few participants, you want to have everybody's audio and everybody's video on, and you want everybody to see everybody. But when you have a large event, this webinar is a good example, and even if you have a much larger event with multiple sessions, you want to make sure you understand exactly who needs to be seen and who they need to see. And that may seem very obvious, but I'll give you an example. If the CEO of your company is on stage or wherever they can be doing a recording and addressing the audience, they may not have any feedback from everybody who's watching because they're used to standing on a big stage and looking to the participants' eyes and seeing who's paying attention. They can no longer do that. So finding a way to give them feedback or to get them to see who's watching may be very important, and it may not be an obvious kind of video and audio connection that you've thought about before. My 6th point may seem pretty obvious, but a lot of times it's not taken care of, which is really to make sure speakers sound and look great. You may notice I'm wearing headphones. I'm using the microphone on my headphones, which is better than the microphone from my computer. Very, very simple tip. I'm also facing a large window with some natural light so that you can see my face, so that you can see who I am. All these small little tips really make whoever's presenting look better and sound better. And it's important to make sure you do that for everybody, no matter if they're in a professional studio or if in their kitchen doing this. Everything can look a little bit better. And for my 7th slide, I'd like to talk a little bit about the right tools. And we can go into this. I'm sure there's a lot of questions around tools, about picking the right tool to do live events. And there are hundreds of tools. I've looked into the different categories of tools, and there's probably about 15 different categories of tools, starting with something like Zoom and ending in something like an Expo or WebEx or something that does almost everything that you need. I'm only talking about tools now, because I think it's very important to get the understanding right, to get the process of what you want to do, to create the concept of the event, and then think about the tools. Because if you start with a tool, then you're going to be limited, or you're going to be kind of positioned or limited in some sense by that tool. And that tool may have lots and lots of things that you can do with it. But I think it's better to think about these things before you actually consider the tools. My 8th point is about guiding everybody on how to use the tools. So very important, if you're using webinar, if you're using polling, if you're using any sort of interaction, you need to make sure that you explain to people very, very clearly how you want them to use the tools. For example, we're using Zoom today, and I've seen many different speakers use Zoom in different ways. So we want to make sure that we explain how we want people to use those tools. And often I prefer to switch off functionality if I can. For example, Zoom has a breakout room functionality. We're not using that today. So it's better to not have that available, not to confuse anybody. And it's great to offer some guidance at the start of each session, and maybe even put together a PDF or an infographic that explains how you want people to use the system that you've set up for them. Not just all the possibilities, but exactly how you want them to use it. My 9th point is very simple: tech support. You need to be able to offer tech support, especially if people are paying for your event. You need them to know, hey, here is a phone number, here is an email that you can contact, and we will do everything we can to get you online and to get the system running on your computer. You really have no control over which browser somebody is using or how long it's been since they've updated their Windows or Mac software. So these things will happen. But when people know that you're trying to help them as much as you can, it really helps, especially with older demographic or anybody who's not as comfortable with their systems. I think it's very important to have these available at all times. And think of this like the volunteer that's welcoming you at the start of an event at a convention center. This is the digital equivalent. You need to have this for any kind of online virtual experience. And my final point, 10 points, the final one is test, 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 and test again. So many times we think we've got the perfect environment and suddenly we run into a problem that we've never seen before. So it's important to test on your phone, test on your computer, test on different computers. It's almost impossible to test with everybody logging in when you have the thousands of people logging in. That's very hard to test. But it's important to try and test every possible scenario that you can think of so that you're ready for those kind of things. I have one more slide, which is just a merge of these 10 tips. And if you want to take any pictures of any of the slides that I've done so far, take a picture of this one, because hopefully it'll remind you of the 10 tips very, very quickly. We are sharing this presentation, and I'm happy to share the slides as well. So please feel free to just enjoy the presentation. And that's all I have time for. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll get to some questions later on. That's my email address if I can help anyone directly.
Thank you, Miguel. As he said, we are ramping up with a lot of great information that was all experiential. We do have another poll we'll get to in the future. We want to make sure that we get some information from Paul right now, because Paul has a really great content for us to go through. So Paul, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining. A lot of my content builds on what Miguel and Shauna have already talked about, so I won't spend too much time reiterating some of that stuff. But I did want to just talk to people a little bit about, this pivot that we're all kind of going through right now in terms of moving from face-to-face events that have been postponed or canceled and moving into this digital, virtual, online world that we're kind of all struggling with. What I will say is that I think this is actually a great opportunity for everybody in some senses. This is a real opportunity to kind of step back and take some time to really up-level your skills, to start to think about, how do I produce a virtual event or a digital event? How do I produce or create a great online experience for my attendees? How do I get better at speaker management and training my speakers for this different medium? Because presenting in this medium is different than presenting on a stage to a lot of degrees. We're using slides today, but sometimes slides are not the best way of communicating in an online environment. And so I think it's imperative that we start to think about how we train our presenters and train our speakers for presenting on camera versus presenting on stage. It's a great opportunity to up-level your skills on writing and content management. So I'll talk a little bit about that as we go through this today, but I just did want to give everybody that sense of, this is not a time to be in despair. This is a time to really take this opportunity and learn from it and start to up-level your skills, because I think that digital events and online events are going to become a regular part of the mix now. I think that people are going to start to create hybrid kinds of events. They may be a combination of face-to-face events and virtual events at the same time. And I think we're going to see a lot of pivot to online and digital events just in the event portfolio mixes as we go along. So let's get started. Let's get started with my first slide. If you could advance. Oh, okay. So let's do a poll. Yeah, okay, we'll come back to the poll, sorry. So I come from the corporate world, and in the corporate world, a lot of the things stay actually the same. A lot of the aspects of face-to-face experiences can actually be translated online. You just have to think of them a little bit differently. But you also have to start to think about it in terms of what you need to do as an events team or as an events planner. And in a lot of ways, we still need to contribute to building pipeline for our sales team, educating our customers, and engaging them for brand loyalty. And in a lot of ways that translates to kind of 3 guiding principles that we use a lot when we're thinking of event design and experience design, which is that our audience has a motivation to learn. So learning is a key component of why people go to an event, whether it be a face-to-face event or whether it be a virtual or digital experience. They also have a need for connection. Now, connection online is different than a connection in a face-to-face event, but it's up to us to start to think about, from an experience and an engagement perspective, how do we help people connect online? And I'll talk a little bit about that as we kind of go on. And then exploration and kind of discovery and inspiration. It's still part of our job to inspire our audiences, to give them opportunities to discover and explore new ideas and new experiences. And whether you do that in a face-to-face event or online, you think of it slightly differently, but they're still key components and still kind of guiding principles for us. You know, and for us, we still need to design events that provide our product teams, our PR teams, our analyst relation teams, and even our internal teams like sales, opportunities to share, you know, product information, content, and our corporate narrative out into the marketplace. But we do have to start to think of it slightly differently. So if you go to the next slide, so some of the things that do start to change are kind of how we start to reimagine this. So we need to look at ways to pivot and incorporate digital and virtual experiences for our entire event portfolio. And I talked about this in terms of like starting to think about it as a hybrid approach. So we need to still design the core events, but with hybrid approach in mind. So it's a combination of live and digital considerations kind of at the same time. I think a lot of us who do larger conferences or even smaller conferences often will do things like webcasting, keynotes, for example, or streaming some content. We need to start to think, you know, in a bit more expansive way in terms of like how we start to create a digital experience kind of in parallel with or alongside our live experiences, because we don't know what the future is going to bring right now, and we have to be ready for whatever that's going to be. So again, it's that part of that is that up-leveling of skills to some degree. And then kind of thinking about it in work stream, you know, thinking, I'm going to talk about that in a minute, but start to think about, you know, let's not overthink things. I think Miguel hit on this, you know, don't make it too complicated, but you know, if you have a large conference, it may be a little bit more complicated than a simple conference. You know, and consider new ways of reaching and entertaining our audiences. And then I think it's imperative that sharing and collaboration is key to our success. I mean, even more so than we do now, collaborating with your key stakeholders, from the audience to your internal stakeholders, is really a key part of, you know, the event decision, the direction that you have in terms of your event design and your experience design, and that some of the decisions that you make might have, you know, downstream consequences depending on what you decide. So if you go to the next slide, and this is probably, yes. So, you know, the medium's changing, but, you know, our basic event design principles are not really changing. We still need to understand the goals of our customers and what they're trying to achieve. So we always start from an audience-centric viewpoint of looking at, you know, who our audiences are, what are their concerns, both macro and micro, and how can we best deliver value against those concerns. You know, and then design and deliver great content to meet those goals. And again, online content may be different than what you do at a face-to-face event. You almost need to think of this as a way that, you know, you watch the news or ESPN, where, you know, they are shorter segments and things are constantly changing. And there's a lot that can be done in terms of content delivery. You still need to build compelling and entertaining environments. So, you know, even the environment that you're delivering the content in, you know, you could use that as a way of engaging people. You know, some people are using virtual backgrounds in Zoom. Those are sort of interesting, but, you know, I've seen a lot of very interesting things as well in terms of like stage set designs that are virtual or green screen in the way that they're done, that can be very engaging for audiences. Understanding the audiences you want to reach, I think, is very obvious and part of the strategy that you need to be working on. Partnering becomes very interesting, and then we need to generate leads. You know, some of you may be, you know, needing to do memberships. Some of, you know, I think you just need to figure out, you know, what are the things that you're trying to actually accomplish. And then how we deliver it, you know, might be different. And I've kind of talked about that a little bit, but, you know, there's different sponsor opportunities. There's different ways of measurement that you do in these digital environments, different tools that Miguel hit on a little bit. And the big thing, I think, is differences in how our audiences consume information virtually and online. I think we all know that people consume information in much shorter segments and, you know, and flip around a lot between different kinds of information. So that's going to be important as we start to think about that experience design and that overall design of the way that you do the event, whether it's a simple webinar and a live stream or a very engaging digital experience. So if you go to my next slide, and I think this is kind of the key that, you know, that we're looking at right now, and we're sort of bucketing and work streaming these things in terms of, like, you know, understanding strategy. And both Shauna and Miguel hit on this a little bit, but understanding, you know, what are your goals? What is it that you're trying to accomplish? Who are the audiences that you're trying to reach? What are the marketing communications that you need to put together? What is your overall strategy around a virtual event? And then content is a critical work stream. And I talked about this a little bit, but just to reiterate, content is going to be different in an online event than in a face-to-face event, I think. And so the content planning becomes a very key part of it. And, you know, you need to work with, you know, your content teams in terms of, there's a couple of different ways of thinking about it. Miguel hit on this in terms of, like, you can't always just take existing content and just move it online. I think there's sort of two ways of looking at content. You can think about it as convert, which is taking content that's already existing and converting it for an online experience, but you may need to think about delivering it in a different way. And then there's creating content specific to an online or virtual experience. And that's thought of really differently. And we'll talk about that a little bit. And then engagement. So engagement is going to be critical in these online environments. Today, we're doing some very simple things like chat and Q&A and polling, which are great engagement tools, but there are many more things that you could be doing around gamification, or think of it as an incentive kind of things to keep people online, where maybe you actually develop kind of a loyalty program or a point system where people can do certain things, whether they answer a poll or watch a certain piece of content or engage in a Q&A, and you give them points, and those points can go towards various different things, but there are ways to keep the dwell time and keep your people online. And then the technology piece, of course, is really important. And it's not about just choosing the right tool. Miguel hit on a lot of this, and so I'm not going to reiterate that too much, but it is about working with the right agencies or the right professionals, making sure that your teams are really up to speed on the technology and understanding how to do production in a virtual environment, which is, you know, a lot of the same skill sets, but some of them are slightly different. And doing production for broadcast and virtual events is slightly different than doing a stage or a live event. So if you go to my next slide. And so what we're trying to do in terms of is stay technology agnostic for as long as I think those first three words in terms of strategy, content, and engagement. Once you have that plan and have those strategies and have your content thought through and your engagement tools, then you can start to figure out what are the right tools. And this is just like a snapshot of like a number of different platforms that are out there in terms of, you know, some legacy virtual platforms, some conferencing platforms, some streaming platforms that we've been looking at, some emerging platforms. This is not even a comprehensive list. There are more out there that are not even on this. But I think it's imperative that you select the right technology for the right reasons, for the right event that you're trying to accomplish. So I would advise that you stay technology agnostic for as long as possible until you know exactly what you're trying to do. And do the research, certainly do the research on what platforms are out there and might be right for you, but don't necessarily get yourself locked into any one particular platform. So I think I have one more slide. and I'll kind of talk through it fairly quickly if you could advance. Yeah. So there's a lot of different formats and use cases, and we're sort of experimenting with all of these right now. What we're trying to do right now is test, as Miguel said, and do test lots of different platforms, test lots of different formats to see what's resonating with our audiences and what's working in terms of, keeping people engaged and reaching our audiences with content that's relevant for them. You've got the virtual event worlds, you've got these single video streams, you've got video stream series. There's lots of different use cases and formats, and I would encourage you to test all of them based on your use case and what you're trying to accomplish. Event TV is a really interesting one to me. And it's one that I'm thinking about a lot right now in terms of our large conference, Oracle Open World, which is run in September. We're still hoping to do it as a live event, but we're monitoring the situation closely, and we're starting to plan a virtual event at the same time. And Open World is a big, complex conference, and so we're starting to think about it in terms of, a format that might be multi-channel, and it would be something that would be channels that are designed for one or few delivering some content to many people. But we're also thinking about it in terms of many-to-many channels where people could actually get into a room and engage with each other and literally be on camera with each other. So maybe do a round table or maybe a chat, or after a content session, be able to go into a discussion room and have a deeper dive and a more fruitful conversation after the fact. And we're even thinking about things like, some content and or channels that are around things like wellness. So doing like a 7-minute yoga class online, or a high intensity workshop, or a meditation session. So just trying to think about how could you actually bring some of the elements that are in a live event and bring them into a digital experience and do them in a way where you engage people and keep them online, but be able to give them breaks at the same time so that they're not like just trying to watch content, for an 8-hour period. And maybe it's spread out over a number of days, maybe it's done over one day. So just lots of different formats that we're trying to think about. So I'm going to stop there because I know there's probably a ton of questions. I'm going to pass it back to Angie to go through that last poll, and then we can get into Q&A. And thanks very much for listening and for attending today.
Thanks, Paul. I have to say your slide about technology and the different platforms have blown up our questions. So let's just thank you for pulling back up that, you mentioned being technology agnostic. There are all these platforms out there. I know people are in the chat saying there are other platforms available too. One big question that kind of keeps coming back up, and Paul, I'm going to throw this to you, even though it could be a range. But how long do you think it takes to convert a live event to a virtual event? Like, what is a parameter for that? Where do you even begin?
I think it really depends on what kind of a format that you're doing. Like you could take, you could probably take a simple webinar style event and convert it fairly quickly. For us, we have some like corporate approved, we use On24 and we use Zoom for simple webinars. And oftentimes those can be planned in, a couple of days or a week if you have your content ready and you know exactly what audience that you're trying to reach. For something like I just described in terms of Open World, that's a multi-channel kind of thing, like we're starting now. So it's going to take months and months for that and, and a big budget to actually do that kind of thing. But I've seen everything from people being able to turn these around in a week to a month in terms of, depending again on the platform and depending again on the strategy and the audience that you're trying to reach, and, building in some engagement, building in the right content, all of that takes a little bit of time. I don't know that there's any one, sort of silver bullet answer in terms of how long it takes. And maybe I'll let Miguel, sort of give his perspective as well, because I know he's done a lot of these and has planned them with a lot of people.
Yeah, and actually I have a follow-up question for you, Miguel, if you don't mind jumping in on that, I'll follow up. But we have a lot of questions about sponsors. I know in your history, in my history, we have dealt with a lot of sponsors. How do you include them virtually in your meeting? And that can be from a bag insert. How do you do the swag bags digitally? How do you do a floor plan with expos? Like, do you have any suggestions on how you convert that space?
Sure. Let me start there. I think that's an excellent question. So one tool, and I try to stay tool agnostic, but I know one tool that does this very well is something called Phenomena Events, and they do a virtual goodie bag. So it's an excellent way to give sponsors some visibility, because you can't just share emails out to to sponsors, that kind of thing, but you can send an email from the event on behalf of a sponsor. And this tool is really created to kind of share coupons or kind of promotions, but it's a great way to put sponsors in there that can offer different things in that sense. The other thing I'd like to say is it's hard to, the traditional sponsorships that exist, like lanyards, like the buses, like all these different things, they don't really work on virtual events. So it's important to be quite creative. And if you think about it, somebody kind of checking out of your virtual event, they're only one click away from ever doing that. They're only one click away from going and checking their emails or doing something else. So it's really important not to do any kind of sponsorship that is not very well received by the participants. And to give the classic example, if you're doing any sort of award thing and you have a boring speech, if you're having a nice dinner, you're going to stick with it because you're still having a nice dinner. But if you're online, you're going to go do something else. And most of the platforms can measure how many people are actually paying attention. So if you know that suddenly attention dropped off because you have a sponsorship message that was not well constructed, that's going to be a massive check on that event. So it's important to be creative and introduce different ways, particularly using technology is a really good way to do that. But that's why I mentioned the virtual goodie bag. Does that answer the question?
Can I jump in here real quick as well on this? Because we've been thinking a lot about this because, a lot of our events are heavily, you're offsetting cost sponsors. And, so we've been thinking about this a lot. I think that it comes down to engaging sponsors somewhat differently and thinking about it in terms of content. So what I just described in terms of channels, so you could engage sponsors around different channels. You could also engage them around gamification or different ways of doing engagement. And I think sponsors are going to be, they're going to need to adapt to this new world as well. We've been thinking about it in terms of not trying to necessarily replicate an expo floor for our online event, but to think about integrating sponsors and partners into the content more and into engaging in the content and sponsoring the content a little bit more as a way of engaging, because a lot of times they actually want to be engaged in the content anyway. Now, another really interesting little example we've been thinking about is depending on the type of audience. So let's say you have an executive audience and maybe you want to do something interesting, like do a wine tasting. So you could go to a sponsor and have them sponsor the wine for the wine tasting, deliver that wine to the people that are participating, and maybe this is for a smaller event, and maybe then you would get online and do a virtual wine tasting that's sponsored by one of your sponsors. So I think we have to just get creative in terms of the way that we think about sponsors and the way that we think about how they might engage and integrate and interact with our audiences in this digital world as opposed to a face-to-face experience.
Great points. And, we're talking about those experiences. So Shauna, you talked about the why and making sure you focus on everyone. Miguel, I know you did too, but Shauna, what is a way to, when you think about those experiences and thinking about those individuals you need to really focus on, how do you convert an awards dinner? How do you make sure that people who might have a disability can participate in the virtual meeting? How do you think about those external stakeholders?
So there's a number of great questions coming up in the Q&A that relate to a number of those issues. So we're doing, in British Columbia, we do have sign language going on right now for all of our COVID-19. So there's that. And of course, for the hard of hearing, then you've got the sign language. And there are ways of doing that. So if you've done that with conferences, you can do it as well with online. That's not a problem. In fact, it's probably more educational. Some of the other questions around what are those other roles to put on a really good online experience? We've talked about the facilitator, but there's also the technical side and then the co-host. So the technical is somebody that is covering what's going on the technical front. And then the co-host is really looking at the questions, condensing them, making sure that the facilitator knows. If you had the ability to have process watcher and a note taker, that is also really critical. So we usually have somebody taking meta notes that are watching the process and bringing up the key ideas that are coming up, and so that they can do that summary that's not just a summary of the chat, but it's a summary of the content. So those are other process. So process watchers are somebody I will often have if it's a really complex conversation. So I'm going into a really intense negotiation around physicians about how they deal with COVID-19 and what's coming up a week from now. I'm going to have somebody watching the process who's looking at what's happening. So if I'm not reading the room well enough, they can insert privately to me what's going on and something that I need to be aware of. So those are things that you might not normally think of. Now, I do complex dialogue, so it might be a little bit different than a conference, but those things are things I would put in place as well when I'm looking at groups that have different learning styles and different learning needs.
Great, thank you. You know, one big question we talk about, obviously the engagement piece. Paul, you talked about gamification. Miguel, you talked about like getting everyone else on the platform, but what is that time frame to keep everyone engaged? You know, when we're on site at events, we talk about adult learning and the capacity of how long people can sit in sessions. How do you, A, keep their attention sitting at a screen? How long should these sessions be? And how break-wide should you make it? Should it be one day, multiple days, etc.? Paul, I'm going to shoot to you first, and then Shauna and Miguel, if you all don't mind jumping in and giving your answer as well.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think we're doing a lot of research around that right now. I kind of tasked our team with seeing what they could find in terms of research on, you know, dwell time, attention span time online, how long people will stay online for, you know, start to understand that ourselves. I think the model really is, again, to look at, you know, things like ESPN or newscasts and the way that they keep people engaged. So take ESPN, for example, like, you know, you probably don't have the host, you know, actually talking for much more than 2 minutes before he goes to either a highlight video or an interview with somebody, or, you know, a screenshot of a stat or just some other way. And I think people, you know, at least sports fans certainly will watch that for hours on end. Newscasts are probably a little bit different. You know, I think you look at different models there as well. Most of their segments are probably no more than 5 to 7 minutes long. So they're constantly, again, moving from piece to piece to try and keep people online and or viewing what their content is. So I think those are some of the models that we need to think about. But, you know, you could also look at things like, you know, some of the reality game shows like The Voice, for example, where, you know, it's an engaging model to begin with because you got people singing and battling each other, but then they bring the audience in with audience polling and audience voting. So I think there are models in the TV world that we could start to look at, but then I think we need to start thinking about it again, even from, you know, our own experiences in face-to-face and what engages people at conferences, and how do we translate that and move it over to an online experience? And gamification is kind of one of those things. You know, we've all probably done things like scavenger hunts on the exhibit floor, and, you know, you could do some of those kinds of things, but I think it really comes down to the way that the online experience is designed and what that overall experience is as to, you know, keeping people online and increasing dwell time by just, you know, keeping them engaged and interested, you know, throughout the length of whatever it is that you're doing, and trying to give them breaks and intentionally giving them breaks and making those breaks even sort of interesting so that they stay online and stay engaged with you.
Great, thanks, Paul. Shauna, how about you? How do you your time?
And I think this is all in the design. And so I look at everything I do minute to minute in terms of the process and the flow of the meeting. And I want to know, I never want to go with more than 8 minutes hearing somebody. That's a long time in the online world. I would like to keep that to 5 minutes before there's an interaction. So the design process is always looking at how am I touching back with the people that I'm engaging. It's always looking at the participants. What are their needs? What do they need when they're in that space? Am I designing something where I'm hearing and looking at them? So I'm looking at the Q&A, I'm looking at the chats right now, and I'm thinking about how can I bring in some of the great ideas that are coming out from that so that participants are seen and heard. Some of the ideas of banners and backgrounds and branding and things like that. So I'm really interested in that touch point and the design. And I use so many different kinds of ways of doing things, from getting people to draw and put something up, to getting them to ask a question on chat. But if I'm more than 5 or 6 minutes, I think I've gone too long on that and we have to move on. With that, I will go to Miguel.
I think that's some great ideas. I love what Paul was saying about the lessons we can take from television. I think absolutely when it comes to virtual events, the way television and online viewing has merged, I think in very similar ways, we're also kind of merging, virtual events and real events when we have an opportunity to meet again. So there's a lot we can learn from these different disciplines. I usually give the advice of about 10 minutes. I think Shauna was saying 8, as short as you can, really. There's a reason why cooking classes and gym classes are working so well virtually, because people are always doing things. You're giving instructions and people are doing things. And this idea that there has to be an expert speaker on a big stage talking down to people are just absorbing content, it just doesn't work in the same way. I think if you're going to do something like that, then it's much better to record great content, put it on demand, add a quiz to it, and make that your content. When you want to do something live, make sure you take advantage of being live so that there's interaction between participants, interaction between speakers. That's the real magic of a live event. It's not just a recording. And I think the more we can embrace that, I think we really have an opportunity to break through all these barriers and create really engaging online experiences.
Great, thank you all. I'm going to finish up with one last question to each of you. I want you to give me a 15-second answer as we're running out of time, but in your head right now, how do you see the live event and virtual event meshing together? Or do you not see it meshing together? What is going to happen to our live events moving forward? So Miguel, I've done you last, so I'm going to do you first this time.
I think this is a huge opportunity. Obviously, I'm not saying that this is a happy time by any means. This is a very stressful time for so many people on this call, and I need to recognize that. But I think, like Paul was saying, this is an opportunity. It's an opportunity to rethink our design. I don't think events will ever be the same. I really think that this is going to have a deep impact. And when we are able to meet in person again, we're going to demand more. We're going to want more from events. We're not just going to show up for, just kind of do it because we do it every year. We're going to demand more. If you're going to make me travel, I want to have a really amazing experience together in person, embracing. So it's a challenge and it's an opportunity for me. And I think we're going to really raise the bar on event design resulting from this.
Great, thank you. Shauna, you're up. 15 seconds. What do you think is going to happen?
I think that we're going to get more vulnerable, intimate, and engaged in these spaces. And I actually think that we are going to find far more and different ways of doing things and get really creative. I'm teaching 8 hours a day, 5 days for 7 weeks, and I'm going to be experimenting with every possible way of interacting with in that context. It's a tough one, but I think it's going to be an incredible opportunity.
Paul, you're up.
Yeah, I'll just basically will echo what Miguel and Shauna are saying. I think things are changing for the better. I think things are going to get smaller and more intimate. I think even the days of really big mega conferences is probably going by the wayside eventually, and that people are looking for smaller, more intimate experiences, and that can happen both face-to-face and in these digital environments. I think we're already seeing people getting very creative with cooking classes and dance and art and museums going online and all kinds of different ways that we can start to learn from So I'm encouraged as well. I think live events are still incredibly important and are probably still the best way to engage audiences, especially for us in terms of, helping our sales teams. But I think that we're going to start to experiment with these new environments, and we're going to learn a lot. And I think it's a great opportunity.
Great. Well, Paul, Shauna, Miguel, thank you so much. Everyone, it's been my pleasure to moderate this. I know that the chats and the Q&As were as informative as the conversation as well. So I'm going to kick this back over to Amy in the Events Industry Council. It's been our pleasure. We appreciate you being here.
Yeah, thank you, Angie. And thank you, Shauna, Paul, and Miguel. Wonderful, wonderful job today. Just really enlightening conversation. Just a couple of observations from my perspective. I loved what Shauna was saying about really opening meetings by being intentional. And I love that kind of gracious moment about land acknowledgement. I thought that was really, really lovely. And, in terms of what Miguel was suggesting, I think, and everybody was really suggesting around this idea of we're not trying to really recreate live events. We're trying to design a virtual experience and to be really intentional about understanding our audiences and what they're looking for and what their needs are in that particular endeavor, I think is really important. And I love what Paul was saying about leveling up our skills, like using this as a moment in time to really understand, what are the learnings, what are the skill sets that will be important to me going forward. As we all recognize, I think the industry will look and feel different as we come out of COVID-19. And, this idea around understanding technology and testing formats and really thinking creatively about new platforms, and then thinking mindfully about accessibility and ways to really engage audiences through recognizing different learning skills and different objectives. I think it's something for us to keep top of mind as well. I know we don't have a lot of time today. Again, just wanted to, thank our panelists, thank all of you for making time for this wonderful, generous conversation today. We're going to be getting back with all of you as to our plans for a virtual Global Meetings Industry Day on April 14th, so stay tuned for that. And I know all of this wonderful content will be provided for you post-meeting today, and we look forward to continuing this conversation. Be well, take care of yourselves and one another, and thanks again for your time.
That concludes today's webinar, and on behalf of Events Industry Council, we'd like to thank our presenters again. Again, EIC will be sending you your CE 1 week after the conclusion of this webinar, and as a reminder, this webinar will be available for playback in the EIC Knowledge Hub. This will end today's webinar. Thank you, everyone.
I think our panelists are still here, so I just wanted to say an extra special thank you before I sign off. You guys did an amazing job, really wonderful.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
All right, bye everybody. Thank you,
Bye,
team.
everyone.
Thank
All right.
you
Bye,
guys.
everyone. All right.
Thanks for your time.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.